The Hobbit trilogy, and therefore Peter Jackson's foray into Middle-earth, has finally ended, in what seems to be a stellar finale. But whilst the film does stand on its own, in quite good terms, it's by no means a contender with Lord of the Rings, and that's for several reasons. I think that's mainly because Lord of the Rings was so groundbreaking for the time. Technology-wise, story-wise, and just the location-wise as well, it was different than anything that had been done before. And whilst this is by the same company, by the same kind of director, Peter Jackson, it lacks the sort of uniqueness and unconventional kind of aspects that Lord of the Rings had. Lord of the Rings had nothing to prove. It didn't go out of its way to pander to a certain audience. It didn't try and kind of target a mass demographic. It just wanted to kind of represent the world of Middle-earth using cinematography. And it did that very well, because it didn't try and do anything apart from do that. It had this kind of simplistic goal, even if the means it got there were quite complex. But The Hobbit, because it's been so long, because it's been 10 or so years since that, cinema's changed, and as a result, this film is much different to what Lord of the Rings was. And that is good in some ways, and it's also bad in some ways. It was going to be different. That was a no-brainer, because of the amount of time that's passed, and how kind of technology has passed. It was going to be a different movie, no matter what kind of source material was used. Even if Peter Jackson, God forbid, did his own kind of sequel to Lord of the Rings, it would still be a very different item. I mean, it would still be Lord of the Rings if he did a sequel, but it wouldn't be the same, you know? So whatever he did would be different to Lord of the Rings, because you couldn't do that again. And it was especially different because of the source material. The Hobbit is such a small book, and it's a children's book. Lord of the Rings isn't really a children's book. It's like about 1,000 pages long. So the source material changed what the film became. So one difference is that there's more humour in the Hobbit trilogy than there was in Lord of the Rings. There was humour in Lord of the Rings, but it was less obvious. So like there was dialogue between Legolas and Gimli. That was kind of the comic relief between the Fellowship, was Gimli and Legolas mainly, but there was a few kind of Merry and Pippin moments as well. So there was comedy in Lord of the Rings, but it was more subtle, and it was a different kind of brand. This one seems to be kind of more targeted at a mass demographic. Lord of the Rings was targeted at Lord of the Rings fans, you know, because there was an existing book. They could build upon an existing audience, and that is kind of relevant to this as well. There was a kind of Hobbit audience who liked the book, but it would have been a more kind of niche audience if they'd went just for that and stuck to the source material. So in a way they had to edit it so that they could get the most kind of money out of this film, which is understandable. They wanted the most money they could get, so like they had the Toriel thing, Toriel and I think it was Philly, that was added, and that was to bring in, I imagine, the female demographic. They had the kind of humour which was probably for the kind of child demographic or younger child demographic, and then they had the kind of Lord of the Rings battle scenes and the kind of old characters to bring in the already existing Lord of the Rings fans. So they kind of touched all the bases here and tried to get everybody to like this movie instead of just people who like Lord of the Rings, people who like Middle-earth, and people who like fantasy. And in trying to get all those audiences drawn into this kind of franchise, they've made it too broad, and that's one of the things that makes this half of the trilogy fall flat, is that because Peter Jackson's changed so much, like because he's became so successful, he's became sort of greedy with money, and he wants to like get the most money out of this he can, which is understandable. As I said, you'd want that to happen if you were in the kind of director role of the movie, but at the same time, from a kind of moviegoer perspective, it's not a good thing that he tries to kind of change it so drastically to fit a certain kind of demographic, or to fit a certain kind of film he feels he has to kind of make. But the film is still good. The franchise of The Hobbit is still good. It's just that it's different than The Lord of the Rings, and in my opinion, personally, I find The Lord of the Rings was much better, even if it is just for nostalgia purposes. And that could be the case with a lot of people. Like, The Fellowship was out in 2001, and that's not too long ago, but I think there is a nostalgic element in that kind of franchise. So like, this Hobbit trilogy could never have been as good as Lord of the Rings, no matter what they did. Similar things happened with the Star Wars prequels, right? They were terrible, but they weren't as terrible as people made them out to be. They were terrible in kind of contrast to the original saga of Star Wars, and that stands here. Because Lord of the Rings was so good, these films belittled by that kind of success and by how good the previous movies were, and it would have been near impossible to recreate that success and recreate how groundbreaking it was. But that's just how I feel. I thought I'd just say that as an introduction to explain a lot of where this kind of falls short. And it is a good kind of franchise and a good kind of movie itself if you watch it from a fresh perspective. If you watch it with no existing kind of expectations, it'll be a better experience for you. So the story so far is that Bilbo's left the Shire with the company and has went through Lake Town and the elves' kind of lands to get to the Misty Mountain. He's seen Smaug, and Smaug has then, in return, went to attack Lake Town. And that's the cliffhanger that we were left with in the last film. We were left with the cliffhanger of Smaug above a Lake Town. So that's what's happened so far. I won't say what happens in this movie. I'm sure a lot of you will know what happens. I mean, it's widely known, like, who dies, who lives, what happens, etc. But in case you don't know, I'll just not say it and move on from that subject. One thing that is kind of controversial about this movie and about the Hobbit trilogy is the effects. More specifically, the kind of CGI that's used. Now, towards the end of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, in Return of the King, definitely, and maybe in a bit of the kind of Two Towers, CGI became more prevalent, both in the movie and in sort of cinema itself. And it got gradually more and more kind of CGI ridden as time went by. And we're at the final stage of the kind of Peter Jackson trilogy, and this probably has the most CGI that you'll see in one of his movies. And that could be good in some regards, and it could be bad in some regards. It's kind of an in-between type thing, depending on your perspective. I think that the way it was implemented was good, but the fact it was used was bad. So, like, I think more kind of physical props, physical effects would have been better for this world. So in Lord of the Rings, the orcs were like kind of people wearing makeup, and the aesthetic for that was really good. Now obviously if there's a giant army they need to use CGI, but the kind of physical props and physical effects that were used very well and made it appear a kind of more real world as a result. Now if they used CGI for the orcs, it would look really weird. And in The Hobbit, in some places, it kind of does. The Uruk-hai in Lord of the Rings looked like they could have been real. I mean, it would have been a stretch, but they looked like they could have been real. But in this, the main kind of antagonist does not look like he could be real, because he's completely CGI. There's no kind of physical props used, there's none of that used, and that's more a commentary on like kind of how cinema's changed more than the film itself, but it does affect the film. And there's weird CGI moments in the film that kind of take you out of the experience. So for example, there's a cameo, and this guy's not an orc, but he is a CGI character, and it's really obvious he's CGI and not a kind of physical prop. And it's weird that they've done it that way, because everybody else that's the same race as him is a person, but he's like CGI. It's really strange how they did it, and for the most part it was good, but there was just a few occasions where I feel like kind of physical kind of stuff would have been a kind of better option. The actors were really good as well, so you have Ian McKellen, or Sir Ian McKellen, Martin Freeman, Lee Pace. All those people are really good actors. There's more than that, but those are the ones I know like off the top of my head. So that's just an easy comment on that, just really good acting around the board, which is to be expected, especially with the way that kind of Peter Jackson shows the characters so far. He could be trusted with that kind of aspect of the film. All the actors in Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit were really good with the role. There's no actor that stood out as being shit. Sylvester McCoy's character of Radagast is something that something that's a bit strange, to be honest. Not too sure if he's supposed to be. He's kind of blazing it up all the time. doing drugs, doing doobies, but maybe that's just how he rolls, I don't know. But the character of Radagast is part of a bigger problem. The character of Radagast is part of a bigger problem because there's a few characters that appear to be caricatures of themselves, too far-fetched. So like, you have the mayor of Lake Town. The mayor of Lake Town is something that I despise. He's played by Stephen Fry, who I don't really think's done much acting. I've seen him before in films, but I don't think that's his main thing. But anyway, he's the mayor of Lake Town, and it's done in this way that's like kind of cartoony. And I don't know if that's intentional, because it's based on the kind of kid-friendly tale of the Hobbit. But for me, it's kind of immersion breaking, because his character is just so strange and so kind of comedic in an obvious way, like kind of ham-fistedly put in there to be like kind of ha ha ha, chuckle chuckle, but it's not chuckle chuckle, which is weird. You have his companion, his second in command. I don't even know his name. That says a lot. I don't know his bloody name. But the mayor has a second in command who does play a marginally important role, certainly more important than he has before in this film. But he's still stupid. They don't fit in, the mayor and his little friend. They don't fit in because you have like the Bowman talking about like the world ending. You have Legolas and Toriel being as bloody serious as ever, or the world's gonna end, or there's orcs, or the Saruman, and then like you have him say, let's dress up as woman. Like, what the fuck are you doing? What the fuck is that? It's too contrasting. Either you have a serious film, or you have a comedic film. Like, the two can intertwine somewhat, but not the two kind of brands that are here, the two polar opposites that they have presented. And I think that's partially because so much of this movie is done by Peter Jackson, is invented by Peter Jackson. So it's obvious when something is made by Peter Jackson and something is made by Tolkien, because the Tolkien stuff is normally kind of like more child-friendly, I keep saying that word but it's relevant, more child-friendly, more kind of light-hearted, and Peter's stuff is just the kind of battles, more or less. So it's obvious that there's two films pushed into one. It's not a very obvious thing, but it's something that I did notice, so it warrants a kind of mention at least. While we're on the subject of characters, some that deserve a mention would be Elrond, Galadriel and Saruman. These three characters, all have a scene together, and it's one of the best in the franchise, both in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, so far. I thought it was surprisingly good. I didn't even know it was a part of this, but it surprised me quite well. The effects used were good, the cinematography was good, the kind of way they represented a key character, who I won't spoil, the way he was represented was bloody fantastic. You'll know it when you see it. If you see Elrond, Galadriel or Sauron appear, then you'll know like shit's about to go down. You'll know that this is the scene I'm talking about, because it is just wonderful. It's one of the best scenes in the film and in the whole kind of trilogy as a whole. So they were good. The Elf King was good. Thorin was good, and his character development through this individual movie was pretty good, if not kind of rushed because of the time constraints. I mean, I know that they didn't have much time to show his character develop, but his character did develop for the better or for the worse. You'll see if you watch the movie. Music is something that would be mentioned as a good thing, and it's something that you would probably know is going to be good. It's done by Howard Shore, for the most part, with the finale song by Billy Boyd, who played Pippin, and yeah, it's really good. I feel like the final song, The Last Goodbye, was one of the best choices they could have made. In the West was a good finale song for Return of the King. I thought that was really powerful, but I think this is an equal calibre for a finale song. And you might not think that's important, you might not think like the song that plays during the credits makes much difference, but it does. It does play a big part, because that's the final thing you're going to see and hear, and that's what you want to see and hear, is Billy Boyd singing that song, because it does represent not just the end of The Hobbit, but the end of Peter Jackson's work with this kind of source material. Another thing I was curious about before seeing this movie was how they would connect both The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, because I felt like they had to do that. Because it was the final movie he was making, there had to be some connection to intertwine both those items. And there was. A bad example of a prequel would be Star Wars again. Because there was no connection, it felt disconnected from its kind of forebears. But this is very much connected. Again, because it's spoiler free, I won't say how or why, but the way they've done it is near perfection. The way it's kind of weaved into Lord of the Rings is great. Not only are there a few hints at future kind of parts that take place in Lord of the Rings, not only is the kind of Easter eggs as such about Lord of the Rings, but there's also the final scene. The final scene was one of the best ways they could have done it. And the final scene is something I guess they would do. It's something that I thought would be the best way to do it, and it's something that was the best way to do it. So I'm not just saying that because it's the way I thought it would end, I'm saying that because it's the way it should have ended. It ended by connecting the both movies together. So if you watch that, you'll notice how great it is, because as soon as I saw the final scene appear, there was a smile on my face and I knew what was happening. And it'll be the same with you. If you watch Lord of the Rings, then you'll notice the final scene, and it'll feel connected, and it'll feel like this is a part of not just The Hobbit, but a part of Middle-earth. It's not disconnected, it's very much intertwined in the previous movies. One thing I will say though, is that you should definitely watch Fellowship the night before you watch this movie. Because I did that, and I'm so glad I did. Because then you'll notice all the kind of hints at future elements, and the final scene will be oh so more kind of awesome and emotionally kind of engaging. I watched Fellowship on a whim the night before, and because I did, what I saw was made even better, because I noticed all the things that they wanted you to notice. So that would be my kind of advice to you. Watch The Fellowship, at least, before you watch this. Now the movie lasts 144 minutes, and a lot of you might think that that will be way too much time. There'll be like the end and then there'll just be kind of filler. But that's not the case. The way that the movie is done is just great. The Hobbit is only a part of this movie. And I realise that this is called The Hobbit. I realise it's based on The Hobbit, but The Hobbit's only a small part of this movie. The Battle of Five Armies and Peter's kind of additional content is probably in the majority too. Or at least 50-50. So there's Peter's work and Tolkien's work side by side. And the Battle of Five Armies is done in such a way that just makes it great. It lasts for ages, but it doesn't feel like that. Because the way they do it is, they have different POVs. So like, you'll have the POV of one faction, and then the POV of a different faction, and then the POV of a different faction, and then the POV of a different character. So it's not just two armies attacking each other, it's more intricate than that. It's more kind of complex than that. Because in a battle, it would be more complex. You'd have like people flanking, you'd have like a smaller group scouting, and that's the way they do it here. They'll show you kind of not just the large scale battle, but the smaller parts that play a bigger role than you would think they would. And it's good that they've done that, because by doing that, it doesn't just seem like it's a battle scene for an hour. It seems like there's small battles and small conflicts going on and getting resolved bit by bit. So like each character has their own arc that ends, and you get to see each character's arc end one after the other. And I think the way they did that was really well done. It was the best way it could have been done, and it worked out very well. I also liked the epilogue of the film, because the Battle of Five Armies doesn't take up the whole running time. Neither does the Smaug kind of conflict. So the epilogue, it's difficult to say where the epilogue starts. I've got a rough idea of where it starts, but the epilogue's pretty good as well, and the additional content back in the Shire is very good as well. It's a small scene back in the Shire, but it's a good scene back in the Shire. So not only does the battle scene feel like it rushes by, but the movie itself, despite its long running time, despite its 2.5 hour running time doesn't feel very long. Doesn't feel too long or too overstretched, and that's in part thanks to Peter's additional content, which does fit into the movie somewhat. I mean, as I said, there is obvious parts as to where it's kind of differentiated, but for the most part it's seamless, with those few little flaws. But it would be flawed. There would be flaws in this, because it wouldn't be a 10 out of 10 movie. Even Lord of the Rings, although nobody will admit it, had its flaws, and this movie does as well. Another thing that's going to be quite controversial is the inclusion of the Toriel and Philly romance. So a lot of people, a lot of purists, especially book purists, or kind of just purists of Lord of the Rings and Hobbit, dislike Toriel as a character. They feel like she's latched on to the franchise to appeal to the female demographic. But I think I'm going to be the only person to kind of defend Toriel and the romance that goes on between Philly and her. And that is in part due to the fact that that was one of the only parts that made me feel like kind of emotionally connected, that made me have an emotional response, was their kind of what they were doing. There's also what happens with the bowman. That's quite emotional at times, but like the deaths that take place, again I won't say whose death takes place or what happens, but the deaths just didn't feel like they were very emotional, and I'm not sure if that's because like I'm not attached to these characters for whatever reason, or if it's because I'm just dead on the inside. But probably the latter. I don't know, the deaths in this didn't feel very kind of sad. They didn't feel very kind of impactful, whereas Boromir's death, especially in Lord of the Rings, was something that hit me pretty hard. Again, that could be because I was younger then, for that simple reason. But I just feel like deaths in this movie didn't have as much impact as I want them to. Because I knew people died, I knew who died. Maybe that's why. Maybe it's because I knew who died, so it didn't kind of surprise me. But I just feel like the deaths didn't have as much impact as I wanted them to be. So instead of that being the film's fault, it could be due to the fact I had prior knowledge. But again, that's a widespread thing. A lot of people know like who dies, because the book is so old. It's like 100 years old. So like, I feel like they could have done the deaths in a better way. I'm not sure how. I don't have the answer to that. But I just feel like there was a better way the deaths could have been done. But I feel like the Toriel thing, the Toriel kind of romance, was something that's quite good, and something that just added another element to the film. And I know like there doesn't necessarily have to be a romance in the film, and I know that she was pretty much just there for that kind of main goal of being a romantic kind of character. But I feel like in a way it worked, and it was a good kind of thing to have included. Maybe I'm just a soppy cunt, but I don't know. It seemed like it was a good choice, and something that personally I found quite enjoyable throughout the movie. One thing that I wasn't keen on personally, and this is more down to personal taste than something that can be criticised, but one thing was the 60 FPS inclusion. I didn't go see this in 60 FPS intentionally. I just chose to see it in 3D. But I think the 3D came paired with 60 FPS, because 60 FPS in movies can be good eventually, but that's in the far future. It's proprietary tech right now. It's in the early stages. So in conclusion, The Hobbit was a fitting finale to the world of Middle-earth. There were some bad aspects in it that I described, but they weren't bad enough to make the film itself lackluster. The movie was good, didn't live up to Lord of the Rings, but it never would because of the nostalgia aspect, and also because Lord of the Rings was good because it was groundbreaking. And it would not be groundbreaking if it was made today, in my personal opinion. I feel like this wasn't just the end of The Hobbit. This film was more than that. It was the end to Middle-earth. It was the end to Peter's work and everything relating to that. I don't think this will be the last movie that he ever makes. I do think there'll be a slight chance there'll be something else. Whether that's a different book, or whether that's just, I don't know, some kind of different story. Only time will tell. But I don't think they'll do anything else relating to Frodo or Bilbo or the Hobbits. I think that's just done to death. But I do think there's possibilities that there could be other stories that don't revolve around the existing characters and existing worlds we've seen so far. So yeah, there's a small chance, a very small chance, that this might not be the last goodbye.